On this week's episode of Circles Off, we're joined by a very special guest, Jeff Ma of the Bet the Process podcast will join us to discuss a bunch of things, including his coming up in the blackjack space, how that translated into sports betting, the current state of Twitter, data-driven decision-making, tons of stuff, all that and more. This week's episode of Circles Off starts now.
Come on, let's go!
Welcome to Circles Off, episode number 110, right here on the Hammer Betting Network. Before I introduce my co-host, we preach honesty, transparency, integrity, big brand values for us here at the Hammer Betting Network. We do have a guest on today that we pre-recorded an interview with before. There were some technical difficulties with that interview. We're trying to bring you as close to 100% of it as possible. Mishmash of a bunch of different stuff. You'll notice our guest is wearing different clothes throughout the interview as well. We think we got it down, but apologies for the inconvenience. Should be as close to a perfect representation of that interview as possible, but things happen in the recording business. We had some sort of power surge that basically blew up our computer twice. Two specific.
But the audio should be good. That's all that's important.
Audio's good if you're listening on audio. Rob Pizzola, joined by Johnny from BetStamp, number 10.
Today is also producer Zach's birthday, which, as Rob just mentioned, what a brutal birthday. But
poor
happy
guy.
25th to Zach Phil, Hammer Betting Network's own. Respect, brother. Sorry you got to do extra work to edit this podcast.
Not only is it a brutal birthday because of the recording issues, but there was actually something else that was celebrated in the office today, which was an employee's friend getting engaged.
Which was nothing.
Which is a nothing which we all did a shot for.
No, I did not. I was not there. I would have not let this happen.
But Zach's birthday did not have a celebratory shot. Poor guy.
Number 10, we've got, first off, absolute, I always say Leafs legend. This guy's not even really a Leafs legend. Gary Volk.
He's just a Leafs
back in
player.
the day, Gary Volk. We've also got a big soccer number, as Rob knows. You got to list that all because there's a ton of soccer players.
Well, I mean, 10 is like the number that the best player wears number 10 in soccer. Leo Messi, 10, Pele, Maradona, Zinedine Zidane, Ronaldinho, my boy Francesco Totti, who once spit in someone's face. Wasn't a very kind act. But we forget about that stuff.
Behind the plate, we had the man whose stance mirrored a metronome, Gary Sheffield. And who else did we have, number 10? It's got to be a couple other legends.
I mean, I'm not going to call this guy a legend. I would actually call him the opposite of a legend. But Eli Manning wore number 10. Eli Manning Hall of Fame debate, I've had it probably about 3 dozen times in my life, so I'm not going to get into this one more time. But Eli Manning, that guy ends up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's an absolute abomination, a joke. They should burn that building to the ground. Eli Manning was never, ever an elite quarterback. For most of his career, he wasn't even above average quarterback. There's no way Eli Manning belongs in the Hall of Fame. DeAndre Hopkins, Tyreek Hill, these guys wear number 10. Someday they'll probably be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame because guess what? They're elite players at the top of their game. Eli Manning, as much as I like him post-football, he's a pretty funny guy. Like I never would have expected that. His play on the field does not dictate Hall of Fame.
And speaking of Hall of Fame
Sportsbook, right here in Ontario. I love what you did there. It's a very nice segue. Pinnacle is the world's sharpest sportsbook, available to bettors in Ontario. Find out what pro bettors have known for decades. Pinnacle is where the best bettors play. You must be 19 plus. Of course, please play responsibly. Cannot preach that enough. Not available to bettors in the United States. I mentioned our aforementioned guest.
And with that, let's start the process.
We now welcome in this week's guest here on Circles Off. He's the former VP of Microsoft for startups. He's the ex-VP of analytics for Twitter as well. And he's the co-host of the Bet the Process podcast, which we'd highly encourage that you check out. Follow him on Twitter as well, at Jeff Ma. Jeff Ma steps up and in on Circles Off. How's it going, Jeff?
It's great. Thanks for having me. A lot of formers, which I think means I can't hold a job. So that's tough, but whatever.
Well, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I was told this a long time ago. I think if you're trying to maximize your like career earnings and stuff like that, you want to actually be jumping from job to job and not consistently hold something down. You might know more about that than me. I'm not a business expert or anything like that, but that's what I was once told a long time ago.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said, and there's a book that I talk about a lot called Range, which is by David Epstein, and it's all about specialized versus generalized learning. It's sort of like the Tiger Woods versus Roger Federer story, where Tiger's dad had him play golf and only golf from a really young age, and Roger Federer's mom was the opposite. Basically, had him do lots of things besides tennis until a certain age. And I'm a big fan of generalized learning, and one of the ways you get generalized learning is to go and do a lot of different things in your career. I think I did it mostly because I had no idea what I could do or wanted to do, and I didn't have a very linear path. And I just got lucky, I think, in that I got a lot of opportunities to learn a lot of different things. And so, yeah, no, I'm a big fan of one of the things I've noticed when I was at Microsoft, you kind of noticed it, that there's a lot more people at Microsoft that spend many, many years there, because for a long time, compared to Silicon Valley, there weren't a lot of opportunities to jump around. Whereas in Silicon Valley, if you're somewhere for more than 4 years, it's pretty unique, right? People move a lot, and so you do notice it in that. I think the transfer of knowledge from one company to the next is really important, right? Like, because ultimately you want to work with, like people talk about diversity and diversity goals. Like one of the most important reasons for diversity in a team is that you want to have people that think differently, that have different backgrounds, that attack problems differently. And that's like one of the biggest reasons for diversity. It's not just about, doing the right thing or affirmative action. It's about bringing in people with diverse backgrounds to solve diverse problems.
Absolutely. It's really interesting and well put. Jeff, I'm very familiar with you. I've been on your podcast several times, met you in person, obviously. But there's going to be a lot of people listening and watching this that aren't as familiar with you and your personal background and your story, and how particularly you got involved in the sports betting space. And I know you've been through a ton, so I'm going to ask you to just kind of like boil it down. But what was kind of your first experience in sports betting, and give us a little bit of that personal background that led to it?
Yeah, I mean, I graduated from MIT, and was doing sort of like the beginnings of the blackjack stuff. So I think some of you guys have seen the movie 21 or read the book Bring Down the House. Like, that's my origin story, right? I started playing blackjack as a card counter in my senior year at MIT. And so when and I kind of mentioned this, really had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was supposed to go to medical school, like, meaning my parents really wanted me to go. I was a mechanical engineering degree major at MIT, graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering that I've never used in my life, but also had medical school applications out and had took the MCATs. And then right before my senior year, I was basically like, I don't want to go to medical school. I don't want to go to more years of school. I don't want to be a doctor. And so my senior year was kind of an exploration of what I wanted to do. And, at the same time, I was like learning this blackjack stuff. And so there was this natural, draw at that time. So I graduated from college in 1994. There was a natural draw to go towards either consulting or banking or finance, right? And finance was a natural thing for me, especially like in those days, there was a lot of people going into trading, right? And they were going on to floor trading and options trading, because options trading was all about probability and all about like using, data to modeling. It was like early days of modeling. Like options were all priced on volatility and all priced on sort of like basic math. Like the Jeff Yass, who was the Susquehanna trader that we had on Bet the Process, but also was a huge sports bettor. There's a natural parallel between the two of them. And when I went to Chicago, I was on the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, right on the floor trading. All of the people down there sports bet, and all of the people down there were degenerates in many ways. And so one of the first experiences I ever had was just, it was incredible. They would offer these futures on NCAA basketball, where the team that won was worth, I think, $64. Every other team was worth $0, and that you would trade teams based on a very simple market of 64 versus 0. And I was doing this when I was, 21 years old, when I graduated, trading college basketball teams back and forth on a, unregulated, there was no clearinghouse or anything like that. But you were like trading with other traders and other clerks. I was a clerk. I wasn't a full-time trader. Other clerks on there. And that's sort of what got me into it. And then a couple of my friends, at that time had bookies. And so they were probably the gateway into sports betting.
All right. So now the evolution as a sports bettor, we asked this to every single person, but what are you predominantly wagering on nowadays? So walk us through what you started with. You said you graduated in 1994, quite a ways ago, but walk through the evolution as a sports bettor for you and how you would classify yourself as a bettor nowadays, because we interview a lot of people. Some of them consider themselves sharp. Some are semi-sharp. Some just say that they're rec bettors and they like to bet. How do you classify yourself as a bettor, and what do you predominantly wager on nowadays?
Yeah. I mean, I've gone through kind of an evolution sort of. I think there was a time where I was very recreational. There have been times when I've been very sharp. And, for me, because it's never like people ask me, aren't you a professional? And I'm not, because I have a job. Like I would never call myself the same as, a Rufus, because Rufus is, Rufus, if he doesn't win, he has nothing to fall back on. Right. So, I would say that I'm now, I certainly enjoy the recreational piece of it, right? Like watching a game where there is no edge. But I do have a fair amount of, old school, like I want an edge and everything. Like like if I lose something where I knew that I didn't have an edge going forward, it does sort of like drive me crazy. And like things that there's markets I think that are still somewhat beatable. I don't personally really originate much myself. I work with people these days to do stuff. And if I have someone or talk to someone that I think has a reasonable approach or reasonable, model, I'm certainly open to like helping work with them on, getting down or improving what they're doing. So, college football, second halves, those types of things, college basketball, things that are, NFL, it's kind of hard to not bet on NFL at some level. NBA did not do very much at all. Haven't done much there recently at all. Baseball dabbled in it a little this year again. And baseball is a challenging thing to bet on. It's like if you bet high volume baseball, the ups and downs throughout a season can kill you. It's a pretty tough one to bet on, and sort of have revisited that this year for the first time in many years. So it's been an interesting experience to go through.
Jeff, so before we get on to, we want to ask you a little bit more about like the data analytics and stuff like that and how you got up. But 21 is honestly one of my favorite movies. And a lot of my friends, it's their favorite movie as well. So I was wondering actually if we can ask you some questions about the story and the origins. I feel like we buried the lead here. We have Jeff Ma.
Of course, MIT Blackjack team.
So
right here.
For those of you who don't know the movie, this is a film, I guess I'll pull up when it came out, but this is a film with Kevin Spacey. We still say that? I think so. Kevin Spacey came out in 2008. What it's about is a team of people at MIT who essentially, and again, this is the movie, so we're going to verify that this is the real life story as well. But and I've watched this movie at least 10 times. They form a team to go to Vegas, travel to Vegas from MIT, and beat blackjack and count cards and statistically bet and stake wagers, and then basically beat Vegas for what appears to be in the movie, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And then near the end, they do get caught in the movie, takes into the back room, gets beat up a little, but it ends up working out. The guy ends up getting the mechanical engineering scholarship, and the movie's a phenomenal movie. Highly recommend it. So
we'll have to on the YouTube video, we'll have to put a spoiler alert up.
Put a spoiler alert up. But for those of you who don't know, Jeff is not only part of the team, he is actually the main character in the movie, is based on Jeff. So what we have to ask you is, first off, how true is the movie versus real life? That's what I got to know first and foremost.
It's funny because people ask that a lot, right? And the movie was based on a book. The book was called Bring It Down the House. It was written by Ben Mesrick. The origin story of all of that is in 2001, I approached Ben, who was a friend at the time, and he'd written 6 books, but it's fair to say his career was kind of in the shitter, and he was contemplating not being a writer anymore, had business school applications out. And I approached him. I said, "Hey, Ben, I got an idea for your next book." And he says, "What is it?" And I said, "Well, me and my buddies from MIT, we use math to beat the casinos, and we go to Vegas and win lots of money." And he's kind of like, "You know what, dude? I don't think anyone wants to read a book about a bunch of MIT nerds." And then we took him with us to Vegas, like, I don't know, a couple months later. And he was like, "Oh my God, this is so cool. We should write a book about this." And so we pitched his publisher, and his publisher was actually similarly skeptical of the idea. And so we didn't listen to her, and she gave Ben a small advance to write this book. And Ben and I went through this process of him doing research during the day, and then me telling him stories for 3 to 4 hours at each night for, I don't know, a few weeks. And we produced Bring Down the House. So Bring Down the House, and this gets to your story, was probably about 75% true. He took a lot of the stories that I told him and weave them into a narrative, weave them into a thing with a plot, but did a lot of what is this sort of new style that he created, which is called narrative, in his mind called narrative nonfiction. So Ben has a really strong ability to take a true story and create like sensationalism around the right parts. And, he did a fair amount of research on his own to find other stories from other card counters, other people that he could make part of this Bringing Down the House story. Now, the movie was an adaptation of the book, but actually was the first writer, and this is some inside baseball stuff. The first writer was about a guy by the name of Peter Seinfeld. And Peter Steinfeld, which is the comedian? Steinfeld. Peter Steinfeld. Yeah, there we go. So Peter Steinfeld, and Peter had written a couple movies before, and Peter like took a real, he really went after the story, and he went and spent time with us in Vegas and spent time with us in Boston and wrote a screenplay that unfortunately probably would never have gotten made because it was almost too accurate to the actual story. It was probably more accurate than the book itself. And then they hired a guy named Alan Loeb, and Alan was a recovering gambling addict, but he was also the guy that wrote Wolf of Wall Street. He'd written a lot, and he turned it into the movie that is 21. And so 21 is much more accessible as a movie because it follows some of the very basic, like, movie acts, like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 kind of thing, and a lot of the sort of quote unquote plot, and storyline behind 21, it's not necessarily true. Like, when I went in to see the premiere of the movie, my dad was with me, and I told my dad, I said, "Hey, I got 2 pieces of bad news for you before we go to the movie." And he says, "What?" And I said, "Well, in the movie, I'm white and you're dead." So, because my dad was alive, and he's still alive at the time, now. But, in the movie, I'm from this like home where, my dad passed away, and, I'm kind of like, it's not like a broken home, but like there's this idea that like, because who would believe that someone from a good Chinese American family taught all the right values would get lost in this gambling ring, right? But a lot of the things that they do in the movie, like around card counting and around the team play and those types of things, those are true. The idea of like backrooming, that's pretty true, although there wasn't like this notion that like they would beat you up and like that kind of thing. Like Lawrence Fishburne's character was based on this detective from the Griffin Detective Agency, and I never got physically threatened, right? But you guys have seen me, I'm yoked, so they wouldn't bother trying to
so was there no love story amongst the team?
Not really. I mean, the Kate Bosworth character is based on a woman who was a super smart woman, but like there was no romantic interest. She was married to someone else on the team. I had no love altercation with her or anything like that. There were obviously like some really cool, like, relationship things that developed in Vegas. And there's some of that in the book. One of the sort of like, things is that I dated a Rams cheerleader for a little while. This is when the Rams were, first in LA before the St. Louis move, before they went back to LA. Anyway, so, those were the kind of things that happened. And there was like, one of the themes of the book and one of the themes of the movie, I think that's probably true and probably more interesting in some respects than some of the things they talk about in the movie, because it's kind of nuanced, was just what this sort of Vegas lifestyle did for my like psyche and personality. Meaning like all of a sudden in Vegas, I was this like rock star that people wanted to be around. And like, I'm throwing money around and like, I have this gregarious personality. Whereas like at the core, I'm this like MIT nerd, right? Who, is like, worried to talk to women at a bar or something like that. That idea of that juxtaposition between, or dichotomy between those two worlds was a very interesting thing. I think that we went through, that's highlighted both in the book and the movie, but people probably don't catch quite as much of how like origin formative story it was for me.
So in the movie, the last scene is essentially the main character, your character, gets the scholarship because the whole movie he'd been searching for a life experience, and then he finally has it with this. So my question to you as a person who lived it is, what's like the main takeaway, the main thing you learned from the whole MIT Blackjack Vegas extravaganza?
The main thing, God, that's a really hard question. I mean, ultimately, I think the thing that was most important to me was the teamwork and the camaraderie aspect. I really enjoyed being part of a team that would go to Vegas and win. Like I always joked that like back in those days, the flight out to Vegas was like this complete, debaucherous, loud, everyone's happy, people are drinking. And then the flight home from Vegas, it's like everyone's somber and quiet and whatnot. Well, we were some of the few people that would come back on that Vegas flight and be happy because we'd won and we, triumphed. And, I think a lot about the camaraderie of that. And, I mean, it's very formative for me because it was happening like when I was basically 21 to say 27 or 8. And those years were so, they were so formative. And so for me, like, I do think a lot about the people that I was, I don't really talk to any of the people that I was involved with that in. And people always ask me like, what are those guys all up to? We all went our separate ways. And I think I've matured a lot as a human being since then. And I think like I was pretty immature back then. And so, the question, I don't know. Like, I don't know what the learning is. I mean, I think the learning is, probably that you can learn a lot in life from any experience that you do. And there's probably no cookie cutter. I was brought up in a very cookie cutter way. Like now that I have kids, I think a lot about how I was raised and how I was like guided to study and to math and to value academics and to value specifically like the in classroom part of academics. But I think I learned probably more from that blackjack experience about so many pieces of my career now that I leverage. And so there's just lots of ways, there's lots of paths that you can go to learn.
Out of curiosity, Jeff, when you're talking about sports betting, you're talking about how there is like this recreational part of you that just wants to sit down and watch a game and have some money on it or have some sort of rooting interest. You started in blackjack, you're card counting. I'm just making the assumption that you can basically not play blackjack anywhere now. You can tell me if I'm wrong on that, but is there a part of you that would ever be able to sit down and play blackjack recreationally, if you could, where you can just turn off your brain and just actually play the game for the fun of the game and the blood flowing, so to speak? Or are you incapable of doing that at this point?
It's hard to play blackjack for me. Like, so I really can't play blackjack at any appreciable scale. Like we went to Banded Dunes and there's a casino in Banded Dunes. It's like the Coos Bay Casino or something like that. And it's like casino and RV park. It's like a pretty interesting place. But they had a blackjack game and my buddies all sat down to play. And I sat down, you know, at first I didn't sit down, and then I was like kind of looking around, and I'm like, yeah, what's the harm? And I sat down and played. And you know, it was a beatable game. A lot of games these days aren't beatable, meaning like they pay blackjack 6 to 5, or they, you know, and I can still count, right? So I sat down and I was like counting, and I was like telling them, you know, trying to tell them when to, but they don't care, right? They're just degenerates trying to play blackjack, and they don't need me telling them what to do. Yeah, no, I definitely was still counting cards. And I think if the blackjack game wasn't beatable, I wouldn't have sat down and played. Like, and it's funny because I would go play craps, which I know I have no advantage in. But for some reason, like the knowledge of playing blackjack, where I know that like I'm, you know, it's weird. And so, you know, I've had some funny, like Simeon Rice, who's like a guy I've gotten to know. He'll come to town in Vegas every once in a while. I've played blackjack with him because he always wants to play blackjack with me. So I'll go sit at a table at RA with him and play blackjack. And it's like there's occasional people like that are like fun for me to go play with. They'll say like, "Oh, come play with me somewhere," and I'll just bet like quarters, and like, you know, like no one's gonna care if I'm betting quarters, and it's like boring to me, right? So like I'd rather go lose a bunch of money playing craps and whatever than you know, and for some reason it's just really gambling. Whereas blackjack always seems just like a job to me still.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
I mean, the reason I asked that question is because I've heard commentary from other sports bettors in the space. I'm not going to give names or anything like that. It's private conversations of people who, at one point or another, had a really large edge betting on sports, and now they don't have that edge, and they just cannot bet on sports in a way that is like meaningful to them. They've lost all interest in sports altogether. It was never about the sports, it was about the betting. And I was just curious about the game of blackjack for you, and that's sort of the reason that.
Yeah, it's similar, and I never thought about it like that, because like when you have that edge and it's gone, like you don't, you know, again, like yeah, interesting. I never thought about that.
I want to shift into a little bit of data analytics. So when I did the intro for you, obviously, if someone were to look at your resume from top to bottom, you're very much known for your use of data analytics. You've been very vocal about it, data-driven decision making over the years. But then we've had side conversations, Jeff. We've done the Calcutta auctions together, where sometimes you kind of just say things like, you know, I'm kind of going with intuition here, or my own judgment. How do you go about balancing the use of analytics with your human judgment when you're making decisions? And this can apply to business, it can apply to sports betting, it can apply to anything. But how do you find that you're able to balance the two?
I mean, I'm not sure which conversations you're talking about in terms of the Calcutta or anything like that. Like, but I very seldomly, if I have data available to me in a model that I believe in, will use intuition over a model or data. Like I'm always going to be leaning towards the data and analytics side if it's available to me and I believe in it. Like in all the Calcuttas and the golf Calcuttas, there's a model, and the other Calcuttas we've done, I've always had a model, right? I've always had something that I like leaned in on that I believed would give me an edge over the people that I was competing against. I don't think I would go into, and I know I haven't, like there's been times where there's been, you know, potentially opportunities to be in Calcuttas without a model, and I haven't wanted to do them. So in terms of intuition and the role intuition plays, I think in startups, which I've done, you know, 4 of, it's challenging to be truly data driven because you don't have a lot of data when you're starting off in a company. Like, and so ultimately, to make better decisions in life, and we just recorded about the process, and we had Elihu on, and we were talking about, you know, when he was a lawyer and just the way that he would actually like calculate probabilities around, you know, like for insurance companies and things like that, around like different outcomes or different verdicts and expected value and whatnot. Like I love thinking in that way because it gives you a framework to make decisions. Making decisions is hard, right? And I think that the reality is that the reason making decisions is hard is because, one, we don't have frameworks, and 2, because we're emotional, right, as human beings, and we are prone to cognitive biases which drive us to make bad decisions. You know, we talk all about like recency bias or things like that. In gambling, you know, we all that gamble with analytics take advantage of cognitive biases, right? Like there was a time back in the day, it was as simple as, betting against the team that got blown out the week before in football, and you would probably have a small edge because people would overreact to what had just happened recently, right? Obviously, it's not that simple anymore, but there's still residual amounts of that, right? Like teams getting blown out on a Monday night or whatnot, or teams that are like really underperforming, but maybe like they're underperforming by results, like point standpoint, but their underlying metrics are maybe better than what they've seen, and so yeah, I mean, I will always be on the data and analytics side in terms of decision making if I can be.
Do you think it's healthy at all, though, to question it? So, I mean, you're co-host with Rufus, right? And I've done some shows with you guys, and during football season mainly, where Rufus might give out numbers, and I might question those numbers and say, how do you think that is possibly correct? And his answer is like, I've back tested this model for years, and I use it, and I've had success with it. I think there's obviously, I'm on the other side of things, right? Like I'm a very data-driven person, but I question a lot of the outputs a lot. I don't know if that's actually a healthy practice or not. And if I would rather be better off just sitting back and saying, no, you know what? This is the model. It's been successful. I'm just going to fire on this, and this. But I feel like there's part of me that just can't do that. And I don't know if it's just a, personal characteristics or traits or anything like that, or whether it's actually healthy to constantly be questioning outputs that might not necessarily look correct to you. And I'm just curious what your take is on that. If you think that's like a healthy thing to do, generally speaking, or if you think bettors would just be better off, building out their models and just flat out trusting the outputs as long as there's some sort of proven measurements via error metrics, ROI in the past that indicate that this is likely going to lead to success.
I mean, it's the most difficult question in all of data and analytics and modeling specifically, is like, how much should you question a model? How, stationary or stability or stationary over time, like the idea that models, that things change, right? And data changes. And so ultimately, we talked about this again today on the podcast a little bit, just because the idea of questioning, how quickly do you question your model if it's producing, and we had this exact discussion, honestly. And so I mean, I think it's really healthy to continue to always question your model in good times and in bad times, because ultimately you want to understand, like we're not, so blackjack, right? There's a continuum here, right? Blackjack is a game that's completely closed. It's a game that's stable over time.
Yep.
It's stationary. It's all of that, right? Meaning like the game, if the rules change, if they're dealing out of a different kind of deck of cards, right? There's no subjectivity to what the dealer says or does. The players at the table don't matter. The other players at the table don't matter. Sorry to all of you guys that believe they do, but they don't matter.
I'm glad you said that, by the way, Jeff.
Yeah.
Wait, are you sure?
Yeah, and
are you sure, Jeff?
But yeah. But so even though in blackjack, what's interesting is there was a casino in Chicago, or just outside of Chicago, in Elgin, Illinois. It's called the Grand Victoria. And when I was living out in Chicago, it was a casino that had just opened, right? So what's interesting is, I don't think people will remember this, but essentially when we started playing blackjack, there were probably casinos in 2 states. When we were done playing blackjack, there was casinos in like 30 some states. It was crazy. And the Elgin Grand Victoria Casino, they had this incredible game for us. They basically had this like flat layout of just, I want to say like 40, 50 blackjack tables, all with $2,000 maximums, and which is like reasonable and all with like $5 to $10 minimums. And it was a place that there were tons of people always standing around, so we could all stand around and blend in, and we could go and play there. And they took the action, meaning like someone betting $2,000 did not freak them out. And the first few months they were open, we played there a ton, and we got creamed. And we got creamed to the point where we were like, huh, what's going on here? And we even questioned blackjack. And so we went on there and just did some random sampling and counting of shoes without playing, where we were essentially just making sure that enough of these shoes like ended at zero, which they kind of should if you're card counting. Like, you know, like we basically looked at what the distribution, we did a hand test of all of these, and we found that it was normal, and we kept playing there and eventually started to cream them. But the reality is, like, you should be constantly checking things. Now, in that case, we weren't testing a model. We were testing to make sure they weren't quote unquote cheating, honestly, is what we were worried. Like maybe they had taken some tens out of the card deck or anything like that. And really, like, we were being paranoid. There was no reason that would have, like, these are people, they're not, casinos are not doing this in the mid 90s. They weren't doing this. Like late 90s, they weren't doing this, I don't think.
You're like, wait, we're supposed to be
in the
beating
US.
you. How could you be beating us? And then you had to check a third cheat. No, it makes sense. Quick question for you, Jeff. Actually, this is one that I've been asked and don't know how to answer it correctly. If you are playing, let's say you're counting blackjack right now. If you have like all 5 seats at the table under your, like, whether it's you or 4 buddies, would that make a difference at all to the game?
No, I mean, not really, but depending on what you were doing, right? If you're just straight card counting, the only time it would matter is you could kind of play a bit more optimally at the end of a shoe, because really, like, the right like most positive EV thing to do against a dealer is to play kind of heads up, like, because you have the ability to change, you know, and then you want to kind of like spread when like the table maximum, like if you're playing with someone else there, you want to play 2 hands to like decrease the variance. So there's like this push and pull between being able to change your bet as many times as you get more information and actually like trying to minimize the amount of variance you have. So no, but if you were doing other things like cuts or shuffle tracking or things that are more advanced games where you need to actually control which cards go where, like, and you have an ability to do that, then certainly having all the seats at the table is the only way to do it. So, but just standard card counting or what people are doing, no, it doesn't really matter.
So if you're standard card counting, though, you would want the furthest, like the last hand at the table, though, so you get more information.
No, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
All right, fair enough.
That's just on the margin. Yeah.
Understood. Right. So do you want to ask about Twitter? Are we going to go into?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about it. I mean, it's very current affairs, and you know, as someone in your case, Jeff, who is very heavily involved, VP of a section of the company, when you see what's going on with Twitter nowadays, first of all, I'm making the assumption that most people feel that the product has gone downhill.
Yeah, you can't ask a loaded question.
Because, well, I feel like the product has gone downhill, and I think the general consensus is that way, but that might be my inner community. But what do you think of the current state of Twitter overall, Jeff? And if it has gone downhill in your eyes, as someone who was so heavily involved in the company, do you like take that personally? Do you feel some sense of pain with that?
I mean, I still have a really good friend that works there, and he's pretty high up there. And so I actually was just talking to him yesterday a little bit about it. Their numbers are better than ever. So if the product is going downhill, it's definitely not being reflected right now in their usage numbers. The actual product experience for me has gotten better with the For You stuff personally. Like, not to get too like, the For You tab is really interesting to me because it's made me discover, it's created a new experience for me. I think there's a lot of noise there now because there's people that you don't follow that all of a sudden appear in your For You. But I spend so much time on Twitter that I don't mind the self filtering of the product. I think the Elon stuff is tough because, you know, he has a style that is that's tough to deal with, and it's tough to embrace. Like, one of the things that was amazing about working at Twitter was just the people and the culture there was really an incredible culture, and that's one of the reasons that made it so special. But I used to joke that working at Twitter was like working at like one of the largest nonprofits in the world, because you're sort of working on Jack's gift to the world. And, you know, the idea that, you know, you're monetized, like, there were too many people working at Twitter, right? When I sold my company to Twitter, Alex Rutter, who was the VP, and this is like a fascinatingly funny story now. He was running all of engineering at Twitter, and he had 1,600 engineers working for him. And he said to me, he goes, Jeff, we have 1,600 engineers. SpaceX has 1,600 engineers. SpaceX is landing shit on the moon. We're a messaging app, right? And this is in 2015, right? So this was like an incredible precursor to what was to come. But yeah, I mean, I think Twitter had too many people working there. It was bloated. And I think Twitter needed to innovate more. But at the core, Twitter is an incredible phenomenon, right? And for me personally, like I haven't even looked at Threads. Like I don't really have any interest to go over to Threads. And I have invested a lot in Twitter and like the people in Twitter. And like, yeah, I guess I think there's a lot of noise right now. And I think, Threads maybe is an existential threat to Twitter, but there's been lots of existential threats to Twitter since I've been there and since I was there and since in the last 15 years. And maybe this is the biggest one, but like ultimately for me, like I still have a great Twitter experience. I haven't noticed anything that's changed that much.
Yeah,
it's
why
a
do you
little
think
bit
it's
noisier
bad, Rob?
than it used to be.
Yeah, so like it's interesting hearing Jeff's perspective on that, because for me, like the For You tab is the bane of my existence.
You can just use the following, no?
For sure, but
Okay.
sometimes Twitter will do an update where it like resets it back to the For You tab. I don't know if that's intentional or if it's a bug, but like I will just get most of the stuff in my life that I don't want to see is filtered to me in the For You tab, because it's in the gambling Twitter space that I find to be like a toxic culture. Now, maybe Jeff doesn't consume a lot of gambling Twitter, or he does and enjoys that. But for me, like it's intentionally feeding me stuff that I'm trying to avoid. That's why I love the following tab. It's because it's like, this is my curated list of people I want to see, people that I care about. But it's a matter of perspective, right? Because even when I publicly tweeted maybe 2 months ago about how I hate the For You tab, and it was a very mixed reaction to that as well. So for some people it works and some people it doesn't. But, I will say, as much as I have personally stated, I think the product has gone downhill. I don't spend as much time on Twitter as I used to, but I still spend a lot of time on Twitter. And like I personally created a Threads account this week, just checking it out. And within a day, I was like, I have no longevity or interest in using Threads, like absolutely none, and was back to Twitter. So there's something sticky about it for sure. And maybe it's just the thought of having to rebuild a brand or like my own social profile, which I've built over the course of 10 years on a new platform, is like too overwhelming that I'll never do it. But I don't know, there is something sticky to there. And honestly, as a sports bettor, and you can attest to this, Johnny, I'm so heavily reliant on Twitter
For news and stuff.
for news. And I don't know if there's like a world where that's ever going to change, because it's exactly what you need as a bettor in real time. It's essentially just a real time curated news feed. And who's going to do that better for sports bettors? I don't know that it can be done better.
Yeah, just an FYI, I think Twitter got significantly better since I guess the Elon took it over. Like in my opinion, significantly better. Also recommended for you, Rob, would be, I used to get bad stuff in my For You feed, which was like I didn't want to see. But like if you actually give the thing info, it will improve. So if you like, whenever you see something you don't want, instead of just scrolling past it, literally click on it and mute it, and then or block that account, and then you won't get stuff like that, and it'll not subconsciously, it's an algorithm. The algorithm will just update, and then you'll have a better feed.
Jeff's laughing here because we're kind of talking. I think.
Well, do you agree, Jeff, or are you?
So, I mean, I think the thing with Twitter is that there's still just like a lot of really good people there, really smart people that understand how to build products, and every decision they make is data driven. It's all around experiments. And, if they're putting this For You tab out there, there's a reason for it, right? Ultimately. And so, the original question around, do I like pull for Twitter, and does it like worry me what's happening? I just think Twitter's a phenomenon that'll be around forever. I don't ever really worry about it. I worry about the people a little bit there, just because they're such good people, and the people that are still there, it's at this point, it's almost like Stockholm syndrome. Like I don't really like they're there and they're enjoying it. And for whatever reason, they're enjoying, I mean, these guys guys and girls work around the clock. They work so hard. There's a buddy that um, that's there. He's like a +1 handicap. He's awesome. I used to golf with him every once in a while. I haven't golfed with him in probably 9 months because he works so much. And he loves it because he gets a lot of time, with Elon and whatnot. I think Elon is a very interesting person to spend time with. I mean, regardless of sort of what you think about him, he's had some level of success in life, and he's probably got some things that you can learn from.
Speaking of working so much, you guys are at like 1 million episodes now of Bet the Process, which kudos to you for one, because we are in episode 110 here. And me and Johnny had this conversation on air last week about how we got to like 80 episodes and it was like, what are we going to do going forwards? And then we kind of crafted this plan of attack. I want to talk about Bet the Process because a lot of people do listen to it. But I get a lot of people who, for some reason, I guess because we interact, Jeff, they think that I like know you really well and talk to you regularly, but they always ask me as if I'm going to answer on your behalf. Why does Jeff do Bet the Process? Like, what's the motivation for the podcast? They don't have sponsors. You guys have talked openly on air about how it's kind of like a sunk cost where you just, you're putting your own money into getting it produced. And I don't know the answer to that. So for the people out there, what's the motivation for doing Bet the Process for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed a little bit over time, and it's just funny that we're having this conversation because I think this football season is the first real season that we're going to think about how to monetize it. But when we first started it, I have been relevant in sports media in my life. Like I was on ESPN for 2 years doing Sports Center. I've was on Fox Business for a while. Like I've been an on air. I've done, I do Tony Kornheiser every week and that kind of thing. Like, and I was never good on television. Like I will say that. I will own that I wasn't good. And could I have gotten good? I could have probably gotten better because I sucked, but yeah, I could have gotten better. But was it ever something that I was going to love? I'm not sure. And so as I was kind of like leaving that world of relevancy or like irrelevant, I mean, like, I don't want to overplay how relevant what I was, but there was a time where you could find my content on different platforms. As I was leaving that world, like I had an agent who was trying to book me on different things, and a lot of the things that he was trying to book me on, I just wasn't that interested in, and not really worth the time. And I was like, well, I like doing podcasts, and how do I like kind of remain relevant and have some kind of a platform? And so I really just decided that I wanted to do a podcast. And Rufus and I didn't even know each other that well at the time, but I like asked him if he wanted to do the podcast with me. And, when we started, I think we were very, Rufus used to be very anti-tout. Now he's a tout. So it's not like things have changed over time. Just kidding. No, I mean, like when we started, we definitely felt like there was a need and an opportunity to elevate the conversation around sports betting. I mean, I think you guys have thought the same thing. And there's, since we did this, which was 5 or 6 years ago, I think at least 6 or 7 years ago, there was really bad sports betting content. And so ultimately we were trying to raise, and as part of that, ultimately we made a pledge to each other that we weren't going to just take, the low hanging fruit would be to take sportsbook sponsorship, right? But the minute you do that, it like changes your ability to be genuine and organic around the content you produce. And I think neither Rufus and I needed, an additional few $1,000s a month or whatever it would have been. And so we really wanted to focus on the content and how good the content was. And we've gone through a lot of iterations. I mean, I think there have been episodes of the episodes that we've done that have been amazing, that I would put up against any piece of sports betting content out there. And we've done ones that are terrible. We've done ones where like, people used to yell at me and Rufus for yelling at each other. And like, I've gone back and listened to them. Some of them sucked. It was like painful to listen to. Right. And so you kind of take feedback. And I think part of it is like growing. And right now, the reason I do it is I like producing the content. It takes a fair amount of work because I do the editing now and I do a lot of the strategy around it. Like Rufus is great, but he doesn't have a lot of time for it. And every once in a while when Rufus leans in, like this week having Elihu on was his idea. We produce great stuff, but he doesn't have the time often to do that. And so now we're just trying to produce really good content. And I do think we will try to monetize it this fall, because there's lots of opportunities to do that in the right way now, whereas I didn't think there was before. And we have more than 7 listeners. That's a spoiler alert. And we have like a good group of people that listen to it. And I think it's a very interesting demographic. We have people that I think are very knowledgeable in the space. And we actually have people that listen that don't even sports bet, which is crazy to me. They just like and enjoy the process, to hear the process of how we think or how we make decisions.
When you get to the point of having produced as many episodes as you had, how do you keep things fresh? I mean, like, how much prep goes into a Bet the Process? Do you and Rufus chat over the course of the week? Do you just show up for an episode and do it? Like, I'm just very curious in terms of your style of content creation, and whether, some people are very meticulous in that they literally plan every minute of their show, top to bottom. I want to touch on this. I want to touch on this. How much is spontaneous for you versus planned?
It varies a lot. It varies a lot on who the guest is. It varies a lot on how much time either of us has during the week. There have been times where we've had what I would consider to be important guests, where I've wanted to really nail the interview, and I will have questions and a script and a whole thing. I do think I have like a pretty good skill of being able to ask questions and take a interview in a certain direction. And so, I do feel relatively good flying off the cuff. And honestly, a lot of times it's how familiar I am with the subject matter. Like today we had Elihu on, and I told Rufus, I'm like, can you put the script together? Can you put the high level together? And he did. He put a bunch of questions down that we started with, and then we got into it, and it flowed really well. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, like another thing we're thinking about doing for football season is trying to create more structure around what we do, create segments that, I'm sure you guys think about this, that can be sent out on social and things like that. We did that whole segment last year that I think is really good, but will take a lot of time to do, called Vet the Process, where we actually look at, some other person and what they did. Like, Simmons is the perfect example. Like, I listen to Simmons's podcast all the time, but like some of the process that he goes through in terms of understanding betting is crazy, right? It's crazy how sort of like misguided it is in terms of how he thinks about things. And so, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like it's a labor of love definitely. It's definitely like a passion project that we do around it. I think, again, like there is a way that we could probably monetize it in really interesting ways. I think we probably influence an interesting segment of the market that we could probably activate for a brand or for a company. We haven't figured out what that is yet, but and we're also like, I think one of the things that we find interesting, and I'm sure you guys think about this, is the community that you create around your podcast, right? This whole joke that we have around 7 listeners and things like that. People will come up to me in random situations and tell me I'm one of the 7. Like my painter for my house came up to me and told me he's one of the 7. And it's just like, it's awesome to hear. And it's awesome to like, my wife happened to be around when he was talking to me about this, and she's like, "Oh wow, someone actually does listen to your podcast. That's great. You think he'll give us a bargain on our house painting?" And so, there is a lot of, I do the Tony Kornheiser podcast now. I do it during the football season. I give picks, and the other 2 people that give picks are James Carville and Chuck Todd. We're both political guys, and a monkey. Sorry, there's another, and they but one of the things that's crazy about that one too is there's a huge community around it, where people will come up to me and say La Cheeserie, which is like this kind of thing that they talk about on Tony Kornheiser's thing. So I think I really respect and really enjoy this idea of like a micro community that you create around the content you create and around who you are. I think it shows that you've built something, and maybe those things aren't worth a lot of money, which is a bummer at times, but also, they're worth more than money in some respects, because they're kind of like very organic, and there aren't a lot of real things like that develop over time.
In terms of the listenership, I think you may disagree, but I think your audience skews more towards the sharper, semi-sharp community. Are there thoughts on your end about potentially opening the podcast up to a wider audience, or are you just content with having, it's this smaller subsection of bettors. We wrestle with that a lot, obviously with our own podcast as well, because I think, we can appeal to 1% of bettors, but we would like to open up the educational components, especially to more novices. Do you guys wrestle with that same issue?
Yes and no. I don't think either of us wants to do a mainstream betting podcast, but I think what we would be interested in doing is a mainstream podcast on decision making or on process as being important. Like this year we've had, we had Maria Ho on, who is, a poker expert, not a sports betting expert. We had Allison Levine on, who has nothing to do with sports betting. She led the first all women summit to Mount Everest. We've had people on. We'll have Pablo Torre on pretty soon. We had Evan Wash on, who, is a EVP at the NBA, talking about, and I thought the Evan episode honestly was one of the most fascinating ones we've done recently, where he talked a lot about like the play-in game. He'll come back on to talk about this in-season tournament, but he's like the guy that's figuring out all this stuff out. And the idea of sitting around and thinking about, game structures and incentives around the NBA. So I guess I get more excited when I hear people say that they listen to the podcast, but don't really sports bet and are just kind of interested in hearing the process of how we do things. But like, it's tough because I don't think we target our content intentionally. We don't target our content particularly well, because what may be really interesting to that person, sometimes we'll just nerd out on like specific sports betting stuff that's probably not going to be interesting to that person at all. Like I have a friend that's a huge golfer, and he loves it when we talk about golf and the high level process of sports betting. But then when we get into the nitty gritty of like probably the times when we have you on and you're like going into X's and O's and things like that are really interesting for NFL people, it's probably not as interesting for that general person that's like trying to learn more about process thinking and whatnot.
For sure. In terms of advice, we get this a lot of people asking us questions, but I'm very curious for you. There's a lot of aspiring podcast hosts out there, people who want to create content, whether that's topics that are related to sports betting, potentially analytics, data-driven decision-making. It could be any subject, really. What advice would you give to an aspiring podcast host who's passionate about a subject and kind of just wants to communicate that to people?
I mean, I think it's about caring about the content, right? And not caring about the business aspects of things or like your demographic. Like it's sort of the opposite of how I would tell anyone to do anything in business, right? In business, I'm super analytically driven. I'm super like understand your customer, understand what you need from the customer. I think podcasts are personal at some level, and you need to understand like what is your voice or your platform that you want to talk about, and like just go after that. Now, hopefully there's a cross section between that and an actual demographic of listeners that want to listen to what you said. But like again, if you go back to Rufus and I, it really is around like process driven thinking, and like for us now, it's somewhat about our relationship, right? And about how we've grown as like friends and whatnot. And so that's the kind of stuff we're interested in. Like Rufus is like he's like a little brother to me, and like, but like everyone's like, you're so mean to him at times. And I'm like, I don't know, if I had a little brother, I'd probably be mean to him also. Like I watch my oldest son, James, with his little brother, Charlie, and he's really mean to him. But then I'll say things like this morning, I'm like, let's go get bagels. And he's like, let's wait for Charlie to wake up so Charlie can come with us. So it's like, it is what it is.
As someone who knows you or have gotten to know you over the years, Jeff, I mean, you have like some of those same characters. It's like a hard outer shell. I don't know how to describe it really. I think you're a one of a kind person, but kind of the best way I can put it is probably like my first experiences with you were at, I think it would have been MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, where you were a moderator. And I would be sitting in the room. I'm like, I've never seen a moderator ask questions like this to people on panels. Now, typically speaking, you go to any conference, like 99% of the time, you're going to get a moderator just kind of throwing law balls to the panelists, and they're there to promote whatever they're doing. And you were there, and like people would give answers, and you challenged them on that, which was very refreshing for me. That was what made me want to introduce myself to you in the first place and be like, I really like this guy in the sense that he's just not here to, put on a show. He's going to ask the tough questions that need to be asked. But then I got to know you more, and you do have like a softer side to you. I do want to particularly dig into those panels though, and like the moderation aspect, because is that uncomfortable for you at all? Like you're meeting with these people, probably talking about what the content is going to be over the course of that hour of the discussion, and like what the talking points are going to be. And then you're up there, and I don't want to use grilling because it's not the right word. You're allowing people to answer for themselves. You're just asking questions, but it's done in a manner that is atypical of what those panels typically are. Just walk me through that. Like if that's natural to you, if you do feel a level of discomfort in doing that, I'm just genuinely curious.
I think I have a responsibility to every person in that audience who paid quite a bit of money to go, and to the people that are watching on a live stream, to try to get as good a content as possible, right? And these panels where everyone agrees or everyone says their soundbite, they're very well rehearsed. Like you could just watch that on YouTube, or you could just read a marketing message. And so for me, I'm just trying to be, trying to produce interesting content and try to ask real questions. And, I think it's interesting because as I've evolved in my life and my career and needed to think a little bit more about, being mindful of the people in my life that I piss off, right? It's harder, right? Like, I just don't think I'd be as good a moderator now as I was 15 years ago when I didn't have kids, or I didn't have any, there was less, like, I gave less of a shit than I do now. And I probably give more of a shit now than I used to. And so when you ask, is it uncomfortable, when I had Haralabob and Matt Holt on, and, that's the whole one that everyone remembers, where Matt Holt was clearly like really uncomfortable, and Haralabob, I mean, or, when Sharon Otterman was on from William Hill, and I challenged her, and, I think in a lot of those cases, I'm going easy on these people, which is funny because I feel like I'm restraining myself. But I do think as long as I am being fair, not being a jerk, like asking fair questions, I don't have any problem with that. Like, I think I'm being myself and I'm being fair. I would much rather be that way than swallow my tongue and be a shill for, some corporate sponsorship or whatnot. And there's probably a reason why I wasn't moderating either sports betting panel this year at Sloan.
So Jeff, recently Rob and I've been giving out some positive EV and some negative EV moves of the week. All right. Now these can be anything in life, doesn't need to be sports betting specific, doesn't need to even be gambling related. Okay. So what we wanted to ask you, as someone who has definitely made some EV moves in their lifetime, give us your EV move of the week.
My EV move of the week. My EV move of the week would be to tell anyone that is thinking about betting on sports not to.
Really?
That's a positive EV.
That's the positive.
Yeah, I mean,
EV
if you think about like the world that we've made ourselves into, where we obsess about things that no one else cares about, that we go through these ups and downs. Like, anyone that's bet on sports at any kind of level has had a somewhat level of depression from it at some moment, right? It's definitely caused a negative mood swing at some. And if you haven't, I'm incredibly impressed. But, I've had great positive ones, and it's brought me certainly a lot of enjoyment. But if I could go back in time to the moment I first decided to bet on a game and go back and just tell myself not to, I probably think I would tell myself not to. I think that would be my positive EV move for the rest of my life, is to be one of those people that just like sports for the sheer enjoyment of watching a game with nothing on it. Now, would that be possible for me? Probably not. But if I could somehow decouple myself from that, I think that would be positive EV.
Interesting.
I think this would make for a very interesting case study, because we know from like industry studies that the vast majority of bettors are going to lose in the long run. And the vast majority of bettors know, some might be delusional, but some know that they've lost. And I bet you if you ask them, like, would you go back in time and recover the money that you've lost, but you're never betting on sports? I would imagine that the vast majority of them say, no way. Like, I've had way too many great experiences from just betting on sports. It's a sunk cost. That's my belief. Maybe you feel free to disagree with me, Jeff, but I think the majority of people would say, no, I would rather not have this money back because of that experience, and I want to keep betting on sports.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's definitely been something that's taken a lot of my time, mind share. And, again, like as you go into this world where you have kids and things like that, the time that you could be spending doing other things besides. And the problem is I like to sweat games, right? That's like the ultimate, like someone like Rufus doesn't really sweat games like I do. I sweat games, and I like perversely enjoy it, but I know how much of a time it wastes. So again, there's this whole like protect myself from myself thing that really is at the core of this.
Well, I also think so. There's definitely some validity to the whole you ruin the game for yourself, because now when you don't have money on it, it's not necessarily a fun sweat, as you mentioned, Jeff. But with that being said, I feel like when you're younger, before you start betting, you watch the games for fun. Then you start betting, and now you watch them because you have money on the game. But it's no guarantee that if you didn't have money on the games, you would be as big a sports fan as you are right now, or there, because there's so many people who just lose interest. Like, yeah, I used to like watching hockey and basketball and whatever. I watched every week. I played fantasy maybe, and then they have kids and they just forget about it. So there's no guarantee that you would still be like a sports fanatic right now, just watching the game sweat free. That's the other thing I've always considered.
Yeah, I mean, the last few years where I didn't really do much baseball or anything like that, the summer was definitely like empty, and I didn't like pay attention to baseball, and I didn't even like know a ton of baseball players. And there was like a little bit of feeling of emptiness, but like at the core, now that I'm back in it, I'm not even sure if it's like, again, you go back to this net positive or negative in the world. Like I think you should go do that little case study, Rob, and figure it out.
So Jeff, do you have a negative EV move of the week?
A negative EV move? Like what would I tell people to do that was negative?
No. So like, this is like something that I'll give you mine from last week was like giving somebody a gift card instead of cash for a gift, because you lose the flexibility. So that's like a negative EV move of the week.
And
Rob's
mine was paying for fireworks, like actually putting your own money down to purchase fireworks when there's so many fireworks that are accessible publicly.
It could be anything, Jeff.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a negative EV move is like, and people have kids will understand this, it's caring a lot about what your kids eat. Meaning like you put a lot of meticulous care into cooking them something, or you go out and buy something that's exciting for them only to have them not want it, not eat it, and tell you they want to eat something else. Like the kids thing, is spending a lot of time trying to figure out like what kids want to eat, which I will always do. Again, like I am the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different outcome. I will continue to do it because like I love it when my kids like really, really like something and get into it from a food perspective, but consistently trying to do it and care about it is a pretty negative EV move.
All right. That's a good one that we've never heard before. That's awesome.
I don't have kids, so I don't plan to, so I won't experience that. But I can see how that would be particularly frustrating.
Absolutely. All right. And then, Jeff, we've got one final question for you. But before we ask it, I just want to let everybody know, Jeff obviously hosts Bet the Process with Rufus Peabody. You can find that show, I guess, on Spotify, iTunes, all streaming platforms. He's got a great episode that should be out at the time of this release with Elihu, who's a great mind in the sports betting space as well. So if you want to check out one from this week, head over to Bet the Process on any channel and check it out. Also, Rob's been on there multiple times. If you want to just search Pizzola, go back. He's been on a bunch of episodes as well. Maybe one day I'll come on. I got to message Rufus still. So, last question for you, Jeff. If you could go back 5 years' time, so this is only 5 years, what's a piece of advice that you would give your current self?
Ooh, I don't know how serious we want to get here.
Serious. We want to get serious.
You want to get really serious, right?
So where were you 5 years ago? Were you with Microsoft? Or
5 years ago?
pre-Microsoft?
No, I wasn't five. That was pre-Microsoft. Microsoft. So 5 years ago, I was probably, I think there is, and this is like, there are a couple things that I would think about. One, I think one of the things that in my life that I have vices. I have vices that I love. Like sports betting is a vice to some degree, and drinking is a vice to some degree. Eating is a vice to some degree. Like I do whenever you do something in sort of like, whenever you do something like too much, like it's bad, right? And like, so I think there's probably a little bit of like moderation conversations I would have with myself about different pieces of this stuff. But I think ultimately the biggest thing, which is kind of the saddest thing about life, is that there is like part of you that needs to learn how to assimilate, right? How to assimilate in whatever situation you're in. So I've had, I think in the 5 years, I've probably had like 3-ish jobs in that time. Like one was I was doing consulting for the CEO of AT&T. One, I was at like a small startup in the hotel revenue management space, and the other was at Microsoft. And I think, and also obviously I do a lot of stuff besides my jobs. And I think what I've had to learn to do in life is to, like, I have a very, Rob and I talked about this. I have this like, or we talked about this, like I have this part of like myself that doesn't give a shit, right? That just says what I want to say, and that, and is organic. And I guess sometimes maybe I should give more of a shit, and I should probably think a little bit more. And is that good or bad? I think it causes less conflict in your life, and it probably helps you get through more situations in your life than you would if you just always decided not to give a shit. Now, part of my being is not giving a shit, right? So like there's only so much of that I can do before I like literally like numb myself down and become like a different person than I am. But I do think there's a lot of the unfortunate part of the world, which is that, this is like history kind of tells you like it's better to just, succeed, fail conventionally than it does to succeed unconventionally, right? And that's obviously like part of the analytics lesson and the self-preservation of like coaches and why people don't go for it on fourth down as much. But unfortunately, like that's somewhat of a life lesson. And I guess maybe really, and this is like a terrible meandering answer, so I apologize for it, but it's really just pick your spots. And I think in life, like I probably need to learn when to pick my spots better. And ultimately, like you can't always be running on 11. You got to sometimes be like running on 5 and like running with everyone else, and then pick your spots when you want to go to 11.
I think that's solid advice. And by the way, it wasn't
Is
a
it though?
meandering answer.
Isn't it kind of depressing?
Well, that doesn't mean that it can't be good advice.
I gotta go. I gotta go home and think about
those are
that.
not mutually exclusive things.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think the other thing too that I would tell myself, by the way, is to play more golf. Because golf is like this incredible, this incredible thing that you do for yourself, but it's also incredible as a way to really connect with old friends. Like I did this golf trip to Bandon. I do all these like Vegas trips, and like historically it's been like super fun and like, whatever, but I'm too old for that now. And we did this Bandon trip, and I just thought it was like the best hang. I went to Ohoopee in Georgia and did this golf trip there. It was such a great hang. And on the quality of life perspective and the quality of the trip and the quality of the hang, it's much more of a positive EV than like a guy's Vegas trip, which I never thought I'd say in my life. And I believe that.
You know what? I actually agree with that completely.
So do I. 100%.
Agree with that completely. All right. This has been episode 110 of the Circles Off Sports Betting Podcast here on the Hammer Betting Network. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rob. Happy birthday, Zach. See you all next week.